Started my first startup in '97. The world told me I was insane.
Our goal is creating future economies that are more regenerative and sustainable.
Something didn't match up. Why hasn't this become the next big thing? And that's where we invested.
The whole purpose of achieving anything in life is measurement.
We are more than excited to have Adam Quattlebaum, partner at Dixon Hughes Goodman. This session is going to be covering R&D credits in the built world. So we should hopefully have a great turnout here because, you know, who isn't interested in tax credits, right? I mean, how do we get money back? How do we maximize our return and our ROI? I'm sure there are many credits that folks don't know about. So this should be very insightful. Adam has experience working with publicly traded and closely held companies in the technology, construction, architecture, and engineering industries. Adam's focus is on tax advisory services, and he leads the firm's research and development tax credits practice. Adam also has extensive experience defending and successfully sustaining R&D tax credits through IRS and state audits. So with that, I will turn it over to Adam and let you begin your presentation. And before you begin, everybody, we did put in a poll, which we'd like to know what best describes you. Are you a built world practitioner? Are you building technology that influences the built world? Are you other? Feel free to chat in what your job title is and your role is to help us drive this conversation. And then we'll also have time for Q&A toward the end of the presentation. So with that, Adam, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ian, for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak at the Shadow Summit 2021. I made it in 2019, was there live, had a great time in Atlanta, and looking forward to hopefully 2022 will be another live event. But needless to say, while we're here all together virtually, thank you all for the time to really talk about R&D tax credits and really sort of tax incentives that could really hopefully provide a nice shot in the arm, no pun intended, for your operations just through some cash savings from the federal government. I'll reiterate the poll. Looks like we have about 6 viewers currently. Only 3 votes so far on, really where you practice. Are you working with a construction, architecture, or engineering company kind of in the built world? Or are you building technology solutions to support them or some other type of industry? That will help me. I've really kind of geared this presentation to kind of cover both because it's explaining how a construction, architecture, or engineering firm can qualify for the R&D credit. That's just a little bit different than how a software company can qualify. I think everyone knows that software companies should really qualify for the R&D credit. So that space is a little bit more, how can you utilize the credit if you're not currently in a taxable situation, not currently paying income tax. So with that aside, it looks like we do have some more votes coming in. Looks like we got 1 representing the built world and 2 representing the technology builders. So that's helpful. And I'll kind of keep monitoring that as we go through. But as I said, for an agenda, kind of some things that I was hoping to cover today. And I'll also just point out, if anyone has any kind of questions as we're going through, it's a small group. Don't hesitate. Ask a question. I can kind of stop or find a good time to stop. Make sure we address your question. It's really it's the size of the group that we could all kind of come out here having tangible information that's relevant to your fact pattern. So feel free to toss some questions out in the chat or the Q&A. For an agenda, really just kind of giving a background of the R&D tax credit, what it is, kind of how you use it, that sort of thing. Then specifically talk how the R&D credit applies to architectural, engineering, and construction firms. A lot of people are just not aware that it does. And believing in those types of organizations can generate really substantial R&D credits. So it's really just kind of educating you guys on how it does apply to the CAE space, construction, architectural, engineering. Then we'll talk about how the R&D credit applies to tech companies, and we'll get into a little bit more on how to utilize it. The R&D credit, if you're not in a a taxable situation, because a lot of tech companies who are in startup mode do find themselves eligible for the credit, but they don't really know, how do I convert that to cash? So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how you can convert those credits to cash. And then also, not to lose sight of, there are some current laws in the books that if you are a software developer, or if you are a construction company or in the CAE space, and you're investing in research and development, the tax rules are changing for your investments in research and development, and this will definitely impact our software companies. So I just want to bring this to your attention. Hopefully this gets corrected before the end of the year in the tax bill that the House just passed, as well as the Senate's working on now. Hopefully they correct this issue. But there's something in place now where we're going to look at a really bad tax answer for our investments in research and development starting this January 1st, 2022. So it'll be here before we know it. So I want to get you guys aware of that and kind of thinking through how this impacts you, as well as really what you need to do if these tax rules are not changed. So some good stuff on the R&D credit side, and some bad stuff just on the general tax side if you have R&D costs. So we'll get into each of those topics. All right, so R&D tax credit background, kind of starting off with congressional intent. So the R&D credit was passed in 1981, years ago, really with a goal of making the U.S. more competitive on a global scale by subsidizing the cost of research and development, of developing new products, new processes, or improve upon existing products and existing processes. We just really found that as a way to, when we invest in research and development, we improve our overall well-being and overall just quality of life through new technologies. So this is an activity that it makes a lot of sense to subsidize, and the private sector is a group that we felt, I guess Congress felt like could heavily influence innovation much more than government. So that really since the early 80s, there's been this incentive in place for companies who are investing in research and development to really subsidize that effort, subsidize the risk that you're taking on a day-to-day basis, encourage these kind of high-paying technology type jobs that make us more competitive as a nation. So that's the background and intent from the 80s. It was years ago, the regime was set up or it kind of evolved to where only really large companies were taking advantage of the R&D credit, because it required you to kind of go back and look at some historical data, and just a lot of smaller companies didn't have that. Since really 2015 and forward, the R&D credit has been very much geared towards smaller startup type companies, or there have been certain initiatives in place for startup type companies to take advantage of the R&D credit, including this payroll offset, which I'll get into a little bit later, that allows you, even though you're not currently paying income tax, you could use this R&D credit to offset the employer portion of your payroll tax. So a way to monetize these credits before kind of reaching that profitability stage. So this is an incentive mechanism, which is a tax credit. So in the tax world, we've got deductions and credits. Deductions take your income and reduce it down as just an eligible deduction, and a credit is a dollar for dollar offset of your tax liability. So meaning, let's say you go through this tax computation and you've got $1 million of income, that translates to $210,000 of tax. If you have, on this example, if you have $100,000 of tax liability owed from an income standpoint, and you've got a $75,000 credit, you would reduce that $100,000 tax liability down to $25,000, meaning that it's a dollar for dollar reduction of your tax liability. That does not mean that it's a dollar. Does not mean every dollar you spend on R&D translates to a dollar of credit. That's something that a lot of people get hung up on. It's roughly 7 cents on the dollar. So if I spent $1 million in research and development, my tax credit is going to be roughly 7% of that. So that'd be a $70,000 tax credit. And then that $70,000 tax credit would offset your tax liability dollar for dollar. So a good rule of thumb is 7% for federal. A lot of states have piggyback R&D credits as well. They're generally 3 to 7%. So you could be looking at anywhere from 7 to 14%. of cash savings for every dollar you spend on research and development. Some states kind of, and I guess in the area that have research credits, Georgia has a great research credit. South Carolina, Virginia has a refundable credit. Georgia's credit is able to offset payroll taxes. Most states actually do have an R&D credit regime. So it's just one of those, you got to look at it state by state. But again, a nice incentive on top of the federal credit. So switching gears a little bit, now we've kind of talked about the background of the credit, and then let's talk about how the R&D credit applies to, we'll say, the built world, people who are practicing in the built world space, any kind of construction, architectural engineers. So, what I often say, most people understand how, actually, let's talk about that. Most people understand how a manufacturer performs R&D and qualifies for the R&D credit, but they can't wrap their head around how a construction company or an engineering firm or an architectural firm can. But if you look at it, the life cycle seems very similar. But in addition to that, there's a product development life cycle within the overall manufacturing life cycle and construction life cycle, where you can kind of see where the R&D is. So in the manufacturing space, it kind of starts with understanding that there's a market need. Hey, there's some kind of gap, some kind of problem that you want to build a product that resolves the problem. So you start out with product design, design the process, get into actual manufacturing, support services, then ultimately kind of wrap up the product life cycle. Well, if you compare that, I mean, obviously the R&D here is going to occur in this market need space, this product design space, process design space. Usually by the time you get into manufacturing, you've already reached commercial production. And really the R&D activities are in this first few phases of the product life cycle, the manufacturing life cycle. So if you look at it from a construction standpoint, it's really no different. The major difference is, instead of going out and developing this product and then selling it or making 1,000 widgets, you go develop this product and you only sell one. And then you go off and you develop another product and you only sell that one. But there's still R&D that takes place. So kind of looking at the construction life cycle, it starts off, again, feasibility analysis, kind of understand, hey, is this possible? Going into the design, conceptualization, starting the estimating process, kind of working out the problems, scheduling the project, to managing the project, and really going into actual execution of the construction, and then owning, operating, and maintaining the structure. But really the R&D is taking place in these same stages, these first three stages, and sometimes even into the scheduling and project management. So what's important here is to realize that this design that you're doing, although you may not be making 1,000 units, these activities fit very well the qualified research criteria, the criteria to be considered qualified research. So this is an attempt to try to kind of help explain how construction companies can qualify. I'll get into it here shortly. Really the specific activities that we see in the CAE space. And kind of looking in a little bit different way, here is, this is kind of the, I guess the life cycle outlined a little differently for construction. So again, it kind of starts with feasibility analysis and conceptual design. Then you do an initial design, work through estimating, value engineering, work out the problems, do some constructability analysis. But this really looks like an iterative effort, right? This looks very similar to the new product development effort that you might see in manufacturing. This is where we see qualified time for construction companies. The same would apply for engineering firms, even more so, because they're really spending all their time kind of in this space, really probably this space. But once you get into actual construction itself, maybe some testing, go back to RFIs, sometimes these are the potentially qualifying areas, but these are going to be really the activities where we're expected to see most of the qualifying activities. Then you get into kind of owning, operating, and maintaining the structure, which would be non-qualified. But really, where you kind of got design and development, you got estimating to work through technical problems, into really kind of process improvements and supporting and supervising those things. Those are the types of activities in the CAE space that can qualify. So I'm going to chat and then check that. Yep, slides will be available. We'll send those out afterwards. Peter. One other thing too, I mentioned, so the R&D credit, not only is it available for the current year, let's say we're into 2021, you generally have the ability to go back 3 years and claim credits. And sometimes you can go back even further than that. But generally at a minimum, if you're looking at an R&D credit opportunity for the first time, you're looking at your 3 prior years as well as the current year. For most folks, the 2018 year statute just closed on. So if you've never explored this before, you'd be looking at your 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021 years, potentially prior to that, but not necessarily. So another element for someone in the construction, architectural engineering, really where you're doing qualified R&D activities, which we've kind of talked about everything that qualifies so far. But if you're doing that and you're doing it under a contract and getting paid for it, the activities can still qualify. It's just some additional tests that you have to look at. And we would do this by looking at your contracts. And we're really looking for 2 elements in your contracts. One is, do you have financial risk for the work that's for that? My power went out. So as I mentioned before, the power went out. For a CAE firm to qualify for the R&D credit, you have to meet some contractual terms if you're doing work under a contract. And that's really just financial risk and substantial rights, meaning that generally the contract has to be a firm fixed price contract to demonstrate financial risk, really where you're only going to get paid if the research that you're doing is successful or if your project is successful. So if your design fails, really what are the terms? Is the client able to claw back and get their money back? Do they have to pay you for the work that you've done? Usually T&M type arrangements don't facilitate financial risk. And then the other side is substantial rights. That's not often kind of present in construction agreements, but if there are limitations to the contractor's rights to use the technology that was developed, then meaning that they have to pay to use the technology that was developed because all the intellectual property was transferred to the customer with nothing remaining with the contractor, then in that situation, the contractor would not have substantial rights. Typically what we see in construction is that there aren't a lot of limitations on rights unless we're dealing with like proprietary processes, in which case we've seen that in the past with proprietary processes. But just some things to look out if you're in the construction, architectural, engineering space. You got to make sure that your contracts are in check for your design and development time to qualify. So switching gears a bit, now looking at really the R&D credit for technology companies. Going back to the polls, looks like we had kind of a few folks who were really technology companies building technology solutions for the built world. So this would apply to you. Kind of the same thing, right? But same process, understanding functional specifications, technical specifications, design, development, testing, bugs. You guys are probably familiar with the product development process, but all of this really, from developing software modules, integration testing, working out deficiencies, kind of going back to the drawing board, all of that is going to be eligible. So most of what a software development shop or technology company does, with the exception of supporting existing products and operations. So if you've already got a product and you've got people who are supporting it, kind of bug fixes, that sort of thing, that's not eligible. But really everything up to commercial release is eligible. So kind of looking at the process. So how do you go about capturing an R&D credit? Okay, so yeah, maybe you say, yeah, I'm doing these types of activities, but how do I translate me doing these things to cash in my bank for doing them? So this is where, like a company like DHG, our firm would come in to help. And what I have here is really an outline of our process. Really the different things, the different steps that we would take to go through and quantify your credit, get it on the forms, request refunds for the taxes you've already paid or to offset future taxes that you would pay. So we typically start out with like a phase 1 scoping is what we say. And that's really just trying to understand, hey, what's your potential benefit? And really with a minor amount of time and effort, you're looking at a $100,000 credit, you're looking at $1 million credit, you're looking at a $20,000 credit, because all that's going to really, so you can go in and make an educated decision. is this worth the effort to you to go through the process, and really kind of how much effort do you want to go through. Once you get through that phase, we're moving forward and saying, let's go claim the credit. We're going into kind of data collection is kind of how we get started. And that's really kind of getting W-2 wage, payroll data, getting your financial statement, GL data. And if you have project specific tracking, we will get your project data. We then kind of analyze that. We have a proprietary system that we use which goes in and kind of helps us calculate your credit with all these inputs. We then kind of do technical interviews with your with your engineers or technical functions. So if it's in construction, we're talking to some of your estimators or people who are kind of going into the design phase of the project. And if you're a software company, we're going to kind of talk to your developers or someone who's familiar with the development process to understand kind of what's new or improved about what you're doing and kind of how it meets the criteria. If you don't have project tracking data, we go in and get time estimates of the people who are involved in the R&D credit process, really just to get an idea of what percentage of their time are they spending on qualified activities. If you've got work that's done under a contract, if you're in the CAE space and all these activities are done under a job, or if you're maybe a software developer and you're outsourcing a lot of your development to a third party, all those things can qualify. We just got to make sure that you're meeting the contractual hurdles. So we would review your contract to do that. Finally, we would go through and compute your credit, and then develop the necessary support and documentation so that you're ready in the event of an IRS audit or state audit. But that's generally what the process looks like. If it's a large claim, it can take up to 4 to 5 months, sometimes longer. If it's a smaller claim, it probably could be done as quickly as a month or two from start to finish. But there is a little bit of time involved. So one thing that's kind of a summary of the R&D credit opportunity. I do want to go back for the software developers, or really any company that's not yet profitable or paying income tax. There's a way for you to utilize your R&D credit, and that's through a payroll offset. So if you're a qualified small business, meaning that you have less than $5 million of gross receipts, and you've had gross receipts for less than 5 years, meaning that, say, the first year that you had gross receipts was in 2017. So you had $10,000 that somebody paid you to develop some kind of feature for them. So 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, you would be able to claim your R&D credits to offset your payroll tax through tax year 2021 if 2017 was your first year that you had gross receipts. So that's a great incentive for a startup company to be able to monetize the credit before they're yet paying tax. So important to note that. If you are unable to monetize the credit to offset either current income tax or your payroll tax liabilities or through some kind of state, the federal credit has a 20-year credit carryover, which is great. So like the idea, I think, is if you ever become taxable and are paying tax, you'll have this credit that's building and ready to offset the tax. So even if you're not yet paying tax, it still makes sense to look and explore the R&D credit for either the payroll tax offset or to the credit carryovers, which is an option. But one other thing I wanted to speak to, and really this is something that definitely for the software companies, I'd say tune in and listen. If you're not aware of this could have a really big impact on your tax bill. You may not be paying tax currently, but you may be paying tax after this law goes into place, which this law was passed with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. So in the TCJA, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they put a provision in, and it was basically kind of a time bomb that beginning in 2022, software R&D cost, the cost that you spend on developing new products and processes, everything we've been kind of talking about so far, has to be capitalized and amortized for tax purposes, meaning that you can no longer deduct it currently on your income tax return. So if you're a software developer and you've got really most all of your expenses in software development, if you've got any revenue, you're potentially looking at now, not having much to offset that income tax. So could be really impactful if you do, if R&D is a big part of your business. So if you're in that software development space. So definitely kind of pay attention here and let's kind of evaluate it. And again, this was put in place in 2017 with a ticker and timer to start on January 1st, 2022. So this could impact you as soon as that first quarter 2022 estimated payment is due, which is April 15th of 2022. So something that you need to get your arms around now and say, hey, I may not have been paying tax in the past, but you may owe tax Q1 2022 if you've got the right fact pattern. So a couple things here. This chart outlines the current law and then the future law with this kind of law that's in place. And I should note too, this law is on the books. This is the current law. So unless the bill that's currently going through the House and through the Senate changes this is what we're looking at. So call your congressman, tell them to address this 174 issue, which is really Section 174 is the accounting of R&D expenditures. And again, currently since 1954 through 2021, we have the ability to deduct R&D cost as incurred. That's the most common way that you account for R&D. When you go through and you've got a software development shop or your construction company and you've got designers, you deduct those costs as they're incurred. You've got people on salary, you deduct that in the year that you pay them. There was a few other options. You could also capitalize and amortize, but the heavy majority of taxpayers deducted the cost as incurred. And again, kind of going back to, really the purpose and incentive, we want to incentivize R&D. We want to encourage our private sector to invest heavily in R&D. So allowing a current deduction makes a lot of sense. I mean, you get a current deduction for just about everything else, any other kind of payroll type expense. But as the law is currently written, beginning on 1/1/2022, we're going to have to start capitalizing and amortizing those costs over 5 years. If you're outsourcing and these development costs are being incurred on foreign soil, let's say you're outsourcing some of your development to India, you can no longer deduct those costs, not currently and not over 5 years. You have to amortize them over 15 years. So even more of an impact if you're outsourcing some of your development overseas. So that's kind of this foreign research here. Previously, you could deduct that as incurred. So pretty big impact. There are a lot of big players in the game like Intel, Apple, that are really kind of up in arms over this. But just want to bring this to your attention because as it's currently written, you could be in for a shock on your tax bill. And I should note too, all software development is classified as R&D costs. So if you're doing software development, it's kind of a shoe-in as being both eligible for the R&D credit and both subject to these requirements to capitalize. So one thing that this slide tries to do, one thing that's a little bit different for, you've got Section 174, which is how you account for R&D costs, like deduct versus capitalize. And then you got Section 41, which is your tax credit. One key thing here is for the tax credit, we're only looking at 3 sources of costs: taxable wages that are associated with qualified activities, supplies, and contract costs. But for Section 174, which is subjected to this capitalization requirement, you're really looking at all costs incident to the development. So not only are you looking at taxable wages, you're looking at all personnel costs like fully loaded benefits. You're looking at depreciation on the property that's used by the R&D function. So you got kind of rent and overhead allocations, patent costs, anything that's really associated with R&D is going to have to be capitalized and amortized either 5 or 15 years. Much different than an R&D credit calculation. But again, kind of something that our company's helping our clients think through is how is this going to impact you? Here's a quick example, really just how this would look. So right now, like prior to 2022, if you had $100 of revenue, $20 of R&D expense, $60 of other expenses, your taxable income is $20. You then get a credit for these R&D expenses of roughly $4.2. Sorry, $1.4. So your net tax after it's all said and done is $2.8. Well, beginning in 2022, this net tax is not going to be 2.8, it's going to be 6.6. So you're looking at a substantial increase if you've got a good chunk of your activities or R&D. Now you're eventually going to get this deduction over this 5-year period of time. So by the time 2027 comes around, it's all cleared. But in that year one, it's going to be a pretty significant impact. So definitely recommend that you talk to your tax advisor, understand what the impact of this 174 requirement is going to be. And again, I should know that we're all kind of hoping and thinking, we've been thinking since in 2017 when this law was passed that it's going to get corrected. And the current bill that was passed by the House just recently does have that, but it's still got to go through Senate and it's got to be signed by the president. So there's still got a lot of work to get rid of this. And this is something you should be aware of as potentially having an impact for 2022. So that concludes, I guess, the presentation on R&D credits. And again, I apologize for the technical issue of losing power. Hopefully you guys are able to hear me okay now. Be a little bit about my firm. So this is kind of, we're a Southeast-based firm, so our clients are heavily located in the Southeast, but we've got clients kind of really in all 50 states. We work heavily in the construction space, heavily in the technology space, so two of our kind of key industries nationwide. And I lead our firm's R&D tax credit practice. So I hope to have the opportunity to connect with you guys afterwards, and really we'll leave it open. I don't know if Ian can join, or if anybody has any questions, happy to address those. Now, feel free to pop in to activate your audio if you have any questions, and we can chat through that, how the R&D credit or these new requirements to capitalize R&D cost may impact your company. All right, if no questions, I will conclude. Thank you guys for the opportunity, and again, apologize for the power issues, and look forward to seeing you hopefully live next year.